He's published widely on issues of segregation, poverty, international urbanization, and regional development. And in 2016, this year, his book, Saving U.S. Cities, A Progressive Plan to Transform Urban America, won honorable mention in the John Friedman Book Prize from ACSP. And his prior co-authored book, Separate Societies, Poverty and Inequality in U.S. Cities, won the Paul Davidoff Prize from ACSP in '93. He's co-edited Urban Regional Planning in the Age of Austerity, and he is currently Professor Emeritus and I guess maybe enjoying writing, having all the time he wants in the world to write what he wants to write. So we're very, very pleased to have him come talk about his new book and join us. And so please join me in welcoming Dr. Goldsmith.
Thanks. Let me start by saying what a pleasure it is to be back here. It's been a long time since I've been here visiting my old dear friend Patty Wilson. Patricia, to you, who I am delighted to see again, as well as a bunch of other friends on the faculty of the department. So that's great. I want to thank Bob Patterson for his patience and willingness to move dates around now for, it's been at least a year, right, Bob? Maybe a year and a half. And Chavon for being so wonderful facilitating everything. So thanks a lot. I can tell you how long it's been because the title of this talk, which isn't the title of my book, was to be the title of my book, but Cornell University Press editor-in-chief is widely known as a genius about book titles, so they renamed it. So it's what you see here and what I have in my hand, and it seems to have helped. So I'm going to talk about a bunch of things today. No slides, just me, just words, and I would not mind at all interruptions at any time with just a wave in the hand for questions. My principal purpose is to try to keep you awake for the next hour with interesting things. And I think maybe they'll have something to do with the things you think about as urban planners in lots of ways. I begin with some introductory remarks that really aren't at all in the book. Well, some of them are. This very first part is, I begin with the assumption that I spent a lot of time actually then demonstrating in the various parts of the book that U.S. cities are in very bad shape. Now, there's a lot of contrary evidence. I mean, nobody can afford to live in Manhattan or Brooklyn or San Francisco or Seattle or Portland. We all know that. They're reviving. They're hot places to be. You can't even get around town in San Francisco because of all the Google buses taking the rich kids down to Silicon Valley to work, but they want to live in the city because it's hot there. That's true. They even say Philadelphia has recovered. Yet if you look at the evidence, Philadelphia is one of the worst off cities in the United States, if you look at the deeper evidence. So I think the revival, and Jeannie Birch, who's a wonderful woman who's been a leader in feminist affairs in the planning profession, swears by the revival in Central City, Philadelphia, but the real Philadelphia is still a mess. And I'll give you some of the reasons. Well, I'll give you some of the evidence and then try to give you my reasons for explaining this. What I'm interested in doing is looking at cities and trying to make them places where all the good ideas we have as city planners about housing, about land use patterns, about public services, about public spaces, about parks, about urban facilities, and about social services in general seem not to work. I mean, the number of ideas, the catalog of good ideas that city planning professors and students and city advocates and houses and reformers and activists like Liz have about doing things in cities are just tremendous. They, in the large picture, despite small successes, they don't work. So something I've been thinking about, and I'll tell you what first stimulated me to think about this many years ago. That was I was reminded of, or it was reframed for me when Robert Muir did his PhD thesis at Cornell, I don't know how many decades ago. He then went on to become the economic czar for Harold Washington's Chicago. Harold Washington was the enormously powerful, enormously large African-American socialist mayor of Chicago, who we all thought would be president of the United States. It didn't happen that way. He ate too many French fries at his desk and he dropped dead from a heart attack. Rob stayed on as economic director of Chicago for a while, but it all fell apart. This was a big reform movement. Chicago, and Rob discovered that there was a guy named Tom Johnson. I'm telling you this because you're planning students, and this is sort of part of your history. Patty and I were talking about this morning, where all this comes from. Tom Johnson was mayor of Cleveland from 1901 to 1909. And what he said is part of the progressive era. And what he said was very interesting. He said, it's a moral thing to do. It's a good thing to do to pull bodies out of the river as they're floating by to prevent them from drowning. But it would be so much better if we could talk people upstream out of throwing them in. Okay, so that's sort of a metaphor for the way I'm thinking about the city. How does it get beat up? I began thinking about this before I was deeply, and certainly before I was professionally concerned. I was a kid growing up in San Francisco, teenager in the 1950s. And I joined a group called California Tomorrow, which if you Google, you'll get the wrong thing, because there's a new California Tomorrow. It's not the old one. This was sort of a blue ribbon downtown business group of Californians who were progressive, sort of like Rockefeller Republicans plus a little bit. It's an extinguished species, but they used to be around thinking some reform would make sense. And they focused on, the big enemy for them was called the Division of Highways. It's now famously or infamously called Caltrans. This is the one that wanted to pave the coast of California, get rid of Highway 1 with all those dirty curves and narrow bridges and things. They didn't manage to do that. One of the things that they worked on very, very hard with a formula that said, now that I'm making an argument that comes from outside the city, federal formula about funding for highways then, it's not so different now probably, was something like 90% from the feds, the money, 8%, 7.5% from the state, that was the Division of Highways, and then 2.5% from the city. The city of San Francisco said, we don't want this, because what the Division of Highways wanted to do, I mean, they literally wanted to pave California, but in this particular case, they wanted to pave the connections between the Golden Gate Bridge, which goes from this little tiny 7-mile by 7-mile peninsula with 750,000 people in it, the Golden Gate Bridge across to Marin County, the Bay Bridge across to Berkeley, Oakland, the East Bay, and the highways down the peninsula. It's now 280, through a mountain range that connected this isolated peninsula to the rest. And they wanted to, with elevated highways and street level highways, they just wanted to pave this so that people could get by. I mean, after all, we drive cars, they drive cars, that's what we want to do. The city said, wait a minute, you do that, there's no city left, and besides, everybody coming in from the north, from the east, or from the south has a destination in San Francisco anyway, so it doesn't make any sense. The city simply refused to contribute its 2.5%. So we ended up with what were called in my teenage days, Governor Brown's parking lots, which were extensions off these elevated freeways, the stubs, 4 lanes wide, coming on, going off. They didn't go anywhere. They just stopped. The city resisted. But, I don't know how many mayors were elected on the plank to tear it down. None of them dared actually tear down a big concrete public work like this until the 1989 Cross Bay World Series, which was enough to shake the earth, and it fell down. Actually, my closest friend from engineering school at Berkeley happened to be the state seismic director. And my friend Tom was able to stand underneath the freeway and say, tear it down. which was a great moment because there was still enormous resistance to doing this. So the Embarcadero Freeway, which was a horrible thing blocking the city from its bay, is gone. Well, this is not the kind of stuff I've been involved in on race and class for the last 5 decades, but it was a focus on outsiders doing things that made things unviable for the city. I was stimulated at the beginning when I then left engineering school and decided it was much more fun to try to be a city planner. I read a little book by a Canadian philosopher named Lawrence Hayworth called The Good City, published maybe 1961 or 62 or 63, worth looking up. Lawrence Hayworth, The Good City. I haven't looked at it in a long time, but I still remember. What Hayworth said, in effect, is social organizations like cities, can really be vibrant. They tend to figure out their own problems and how to solve them if you stop beating them up from the outside. It was just an idea that stuck in my head. So when I had some time, 6 or 8 years ago, I finished another book and was sort of ruminating about what I was going to do. I started thinking about this, and I thought, what is it that's really beating up on cities today? And I focused on 4 things: the federal government, state government, corporations, and suburbs. That's enough. So I tried to look at this. In light of the election that we just went through, I had to say, "Oh, am I dead in the water? Is this all going away?" And I concluded quite the contrary. No, maybe the one source we have for initiating social change in this country is the force of reform that's coming out of cities. I'll just give one possibly superficial, but maybe not, piece of evidence. Of the 35 largest cities in the country, I think, now I haven't looked at the numbers since the election, but I don't think it's changed much. 28 are governed and have most of them for a long time been governed by Democrats. Not governors, not state legislatures, not the House of Representatives, not the Senate, and now, of course, not the White House, but city governments. Now, these Democrats aren't all flaming left-wing progressives intent on doing all this, but they are interested in making their cities actually function. They want people to have good housing. They don't want a lot of homeless people in the streets. They want people to have enough food. They don't want war going on in their neighborhoods. They want schools to function. So I focus on these 4 segments of the world. Well, I focus on 4 things. One is city austerity, that is budgets, the ability to actually spend money. The second is, and the problem there is basically the Congress, in alliance with very wealthy people who would have to pay taxes and large corporations who would have to pay taxes. So this is a long story. Actually begins in 1913 with the authorization of the amendment of the Constitution enabling the federal income tax. And they've been battling this ever since. They just won a round, maybe. We'll see. Second, schools. Big city schools don't teach kids well enough. Tons of evidence. I'll talk about that first. Third, city food. People in cities don't eat enough nutritious food, especially people of color, poor people. Again, I'll talk about that very briefly. And finally, there's a problem of drugs, which I'll get to last. So first, schools. It's a key item in my book. Too long. There's an introductory chapter about what cities mean and so forth. Maybe I should begin by talking about that, because for city planners, the problem, what's a city, is really a big problem. And what I do, I used to describe cities as donuts. Very common description. Liz and I actually worked on this quite a bit. You have the center of the donut is poor, Latino, African American, recent immigrant, and then the ring around it, the suburbs, is relatively well off and predominantly white or Anglo. And that, still fits a lot of places. But we recharacterized it a long time ago as rather than a donut, as a checkerboard, where poverty, it still predominates in the central city, but there are little squares of intense poverty in the suburbs all over. We now know that a majority of the poor people in metropolitan areas in general, and in almost any one, reside in the suburbs. It's because of the way we define things. And the way we define things is very strange. In America, we draw boundaries around cities and we leave them there forever, and we call the things that aren't in the cities suburbs. Often it's just across one street. So I'm going to just mention the Detroit suburb because it's sort of an interesting little story. And here it's sort of a talk about a book, so I'd like to quote from the book a few times. Here's one. Authorities erect boundary lines that constrain legal, social, and even physical exchange to keep city damages from spreading. These authorities, of course, are state governments. Cities don't exist. Cities aren't in the Constitution. States and the federal government, sort of by default, are in the Constitution, but not cities. States create them. States authorize them. States legislate. States could abolish cities and occasionally do abolish certainly city powers. They rarely actually abolish cities, but they can quite easily. I'll continue. The chief executive for Oakland County, a Detroit suburb with a population of 1.2 million, re-elected for more than 20 years, likes high fences. He explained his approach in 2014. Here I'm quoting that chief executive. What we're going to do is turn Detroit into an Indian reservation where we herd all the Indians into the city, build a fence around it, and then throw in the blankets and corn, end quote. 2 years ago. Now, I'll go on quoting just a little, perhaps reflecting similar values. Suburban places just outside Hartford, Connecticut, have been known to illegally stop Black and Latino families, city residents driving on the weekend to picnic in suburban public parks, turning them back, sending them home, where municipal services fail, schools don't teach, good food is scarce, and drug warriors attack to choke the cities inside the suburban white noose. Okay, so what's a city? Well, our poor Black suburbs up the Hudson River, just, half an hour outside Manhattan, are they part of the city? Our poor areas in New Jersey, like Newark, that's not New York, that's not the center, are they cities? Well, of course they are. So, you have to be flexible thinking about this and go in and out. I had a terrible time with my editor. It's always the reader's problem not understanding something, not the writer's, so I worked on it. What I'm claiming in the book is that the time is ripe for these reforms. That is, everybody knows city schools don't work. Everybody. But everybody does know. And I had terrible problems when I started writing this book 5 or 6 years ago, and then a bunch of things intervened and I had to stop, and I got back to it finally. And I would get back to it each time and think, can I still write this book? Aren't these things passé by now? And then I'd pick up the newspaper and boom, on the front page were headlines about drugs, about schools, about austerity, and about food in the city. So, and I think they're still there. Andre Gortz, the European red turned green, there are real political parties in Europe that focus on the environment, focus on socialism, kinds we don't have in this country, and they actually are active in parliament. So Andre Gortz is sort of a philosopher, sociologist, who thought about the political science, who thought about these kinds of things. And he said, what you want is reforms that are non-reformist. And what he meant by that is reforms that stimulate the winners in the reform to push for further reform. So these are self-reinforcing reforms. And I'm saying food, schools, drugs, and austerity are 4 of these things that are sort of on the way to do this. So let me talk first about schools. It's simply true that literally millions of children don't get adequate schooling in big city schools. And this includes a relatively smaller number of suburban schools in very poor and typically not white suburbs. In the 50 or 60 largest cities in the United States, there's more than, I think, 60 million people, 8 to 10 million school children, and vast proportions of them do very badly. They don't graduate on time, often more than half the kids enrolled in the school district. And these are usually underestimates because kids have already dropped out and they're not counted at all. Don't graduate. Very few of them go on to college, and of those that do, they have terrible difficulties completing a four-year college. Obviously, there are lots of exceptions, including, no doubt, I hope, a number of people in this room. In the surrounding suburbs, which are predominantly white, though much less so than they used to be, on-time graduation rates, 90%, 95%, sometimes 98%. Large proportions of those kids go on to college. A lot of them go to difficult to get into colleges, and they do well in their careers. They make more money, blah, 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 blah. Lots of things about this. So how do you explain this failure? Well, the first explanation, the one that we're sort of pushed on by, maybe he's no longer at the center of the White House, Chris Christie, but he's been a big, big pusher on this, is that, the problem is lousy teachers, selfish unions, inept administrators, and parents and kids who really don't care about school. The second reason is that there's ethnic and racial exclusion. We all know about that. And I guess the most famous sort of symbol of that is the 1974 Detroit case, Milliken v. Bradley, where the Supreme Court disallowed integration, in which 53 white suburbs and black Detroit were going to mingle their school districts with busing. Somebody sued, and they said you couldn't do that. Now, here's another comment about state responsibility or irresponsibility. Justice Thurgood Marshall, of course, said, well, we're going to rue the day we made this decision in his dissent, and said this will divide America deeply for decades to come. I'd say he was right. It turned out Justice Douglas, in something that brings up other things today, wrote a parallel dissent, and he said this. So this is a case, the Supreme Court said no. The Warren Court decision, Brown v. Board of Education, that required racial balance in schools, did not go across school district boundaries. And of course, school district boundaries are set up by the state governments, and once again, we have Detroit ringed by its white suburb. Justice Douglas wrote in his separate dissent, if this were a sewage problem or a water problem or an energy problem, there can be no doubt that Michigan would stay well within federal constitutional bounds if it sought a metropolitan remedy. So, if that doesn't remind you of Flint, Michigan today, nothing will. Okay, so this is still going on, and we have it coming up in various ways. But I'm talking about schools. So, the reality is, suburban schools, which are eminently successful, and which, if were the only ones averaged into the international school comparisons, would look like Singapore and South Korea and Scandinavia and the Netherlands and, above all, Finland in being enormously successful educating children, with, in Finland's case, astonishing measures of equality among the various children. But they're not. We don't calculate those averages. We calculate an average that puts the U.S. at number 15 or 20 in various measures on math and science and language. How come? Well, on this question of is it bad teachers and bad administrators and the unions, all the suburban schools that are so successful also have teachers trained in exactly the same schools, administrators authorized by state exams and stuff in exactly the same way, who actually, when they're tested, come out to be sort of very similar in skills and so forth. And they're all unionized, just like the failing city schools. So maybe it isn't the unions or the crummy teachers or the inept administrators, but it's something else. And so you look around and you try to see what it is. What is it? Money. Money, 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 money. There's a million people who say, nah, it's not money. Come on, we throw money at these schools. It's money. How can I prove this? Well, two ways. One is a whole number of state Supreme Courts. It's, in New York State, it's not called the Supreme Court, but top courts in states. The most famous ones are maybe New Jersey and Washington State, but there's a bunch of others. The Supremes have come down sometimes with unanimity, excoriating state officials, state legislators, for not meeting the constitutional requirements for educating kids fairly across their states. In New Jersey, the state courts once literally shut down the public school systems for a while in the entire state of New Jersey, saying, can't do this. You got to change the way you do things. And they have something called the Abbott Plan, and they're redistributing. State of California is now redistributing a little bit. State of Washington wrote this. This was, 2016, the Connecticut Superior Court wrote, the state allows children in poor districts to languish while their wealthier neighbors soar. Fairfield, this is a white suburb with 10,000 students, per capita income, per family median income of 120,000, 94% on-time high school graduation, versus Bridgeport, poor, black, Hispanic, 20,000 students, only 63%. So 98% versus 63% graduating on time, 94 versus 63. Quote, this is the court. Their teachers earn the same high marks in evaluations, but Fairfield teachers get paid much more, $25,000 to $30,000 a year more. Who needs more than that? San Diego was a case where I actually got some numbers on this. It's very hard to get because they're not collected, typically cities. So page 109, cities versus suburbs. Here we go. Budgets affect class size, and class size matters. Now, the people who occupy the White House or who direct the Department of Education, Barack Obama, Arne Duncan, not only themselves went to private schools with very small classes. In Obama's case, it's Punahou in Honolulu, from which I've had a number of students at Cornell, very privileged kids who, by hook or crook, got to go to this great school where they have very small classes. I don't know what the average size is, probably 12 or 13, something like that. So, City of San Diego made a special effort using state and federal stimulus funds, remember those, after 2008 collapse, to aid its 30 poorest schools by driving down class size to 17 children on average for kindergarten through second grade. As anticipated, the smaller classes yielded improved test scores. But after the district used up its federal stimulus money and was subject to budgetary restrictions, in 2012, average classroom numbers bounced back to 30 students or more for most schools. Only in special schools and in a few well-off neighborhoods where parents and support associations provide ample supplementary funding did class sizes remain small. The neighboring Coronado district, so this is inside the district, but then I jump across the boundary. Coronado, with 3,200 students, raised donations from parents and others to the tune of $1,500 per student in 2010, compared to less than $20 per student in much less wealthy San Diego. This private funding pattern, beyond taxes, occurs in wealthy neighborhoods across the nation. So, just a little bit of theory. Bowles and Gintis, I mean, you are graduate students, so, you know, we should talk about theory. Bowles and Gintis, Sam Bowles and Herb Gintis, in 1976, published a book called Schooling in Capitalist America. Two radical economists, UMass Amherst, actually very, both of them very independently, very famous guys. And in Schooling in Capitalist America, they argued that, major institutions in society, the press, religious organizations, the judiciary, the school systems, operate so as to divide society into two. A relatively small group of winners and a relatively large group of losers. Nobody sets out to do this. Nobody designs it. There's no conspiracy. There's just a lot of interest acting all the time, and we end up getting this. And I'll tell you, when you look at the school systems, man, it clicks. It just seems to make sense. Now, that's an extraordinarily powerful theory to organize the way you think about things, and then you try to find out how this actually works. I find that it makes a great deal of sense. Let me give you one more example about schools. Wake County, North Carolina, is the county that surrounds Raleigh. In the year 2000, they decided, in anticipation of the Supreme Court ruling against racial integration, which it has subsequently done and done and done again, decided to use income balancing busing in their school district. Now, we're talking about a school district with 130,000 students. There's more than 140 schools. And it's been great for cities and suburbs. Let me see if I can read you one again. I won't do much more of this reading, but a little bit. Four unusual circumstances make the politically delicate task of economic integration possible, they wrote back when they were doing it in Raleigh. First, a countywide school district that includes city and suburbs, quite unusual. Second, busing for racial integration with a 30-year history, imposed, of course, by the federal courts. Third, the local economy was booming as business leaders, including newspaper editors, provided solid support. So this was a system that really worked. Now, this good news from Wake County excited school reform advocates all across the country, but it displeased others. In 2010, Tea Party Republicans gained a majority on the county school board and pushed what critics termed, I'm quoting here, an ideological agenda aimed at nothing less than sounding the official death knell of government-sponsored integration in one of the last places to promote it. I can go on about why they did this, but the school board chairman pointed out that, this is an illegitimate way to run our schools, it's integration. What we want to do is put all the poor kids together in one school, then we'll notice it and we'll do something about it. Well, that kind of doesn't go. So there's lots more going on in the school agenda around the country, but I can't talk about that forever. I have to stop fairly soon, so let me switch to food. Let me call it food apartheid. I'll be quite brief here. There's only one chapter in the book on food, though it's a long one. We have food deserts with fast food restaurants. We have obesity and illness. In New York City, the health commissioner says that 40% of adults in New York City are overweight or obese. Obesity, the New York City Health Department reports, kills 5,800 New Yorkers every year. It strikes particularly Black, Latino, and low-income communities. There are high minority death rates, not just in cities, but people are concentrated there. Death rates for diabetes, infant mortality, cancer, heart disease. You can't trace any one of these to food and nutrition, but the correlation is very high, and the direction of causation, they're not eating bad food because they're dying. So we know the direction of causation there because of science. But the contrast of food with schools, nutrition with education, is just absolutely tremendous. I mean, in schools, we have public organizations. We have school boards that are elected or appointed by elected officials. We have large institutions. We have big budgets, public budgets. We actually vote on them. We have superintendents and buildings and teachers unions. You know, we have all this tangible stuff that we grapple with quite directly. Politically, it's public, it's ideologically necessarily sort of alive. But food is something very different. It's private. Somebody supplies it, you go to a store, you buy it, and you eat it. You drop dead from doing that, well, you know, that's a private affair. So it's a very different kind of arrangement. So what's the problem here? Well, let me quote, this is very brief, Marion Nestle, who's a nutritionist and a sociologist at NYU, who is, to my mind, the most important person in this business. Good nutritional advice is notoriously complicated and hard to follow, isn't it? An interviewer once asked Marion Nestle. Nestle replied, no, it's not complicated. It's simple. Eat more fruit and vegetables, and don't eat too much. And be active, and don't smoke. Okay, so clearly it's an individual problem. Well, Nestle doesn't think so, and I don't think so, and it isn't. Okay, what is it? Well, it's one of these collisions in modern society that we need to think about more. It's why we need to study political economy. What we have is a set of corporations. Actually, it's a very small set, of very few corporations, 4 or 5, that produce virtually all the food we eat in the United States. Sorry. And those corporations make money legitimately. I mean, that's what they're set up to do, by selling us more food. How do they sell us more food? Well, they do 2 things. One is, well, they spend money in 2 ways, but they do 2 things. One is they addict us to food. Well, maybe that's, no, and the other thing, and they do that 2 ways. One is by changing federal and sometimes state and local laws, and the other through spending a ton of money on lobbyists. And the other is by creating foods that we can't stop eating. Now, they're chemists and scientists. I work at a huge ag school. Cornell University has, maybe with UC Davis, one of the 2 largest ag schools in the world, and it is a corporate operation, man. You know, they got little stuff on the side to entertain us, but the big bucks go for corporate food. And they got all kinds of genius scientists designing foods that try to not eat another potato chip. Forget it. It's simply not possible. And so, and this hits poor neighborhoods particularly hard because they don't have fresh fruit and vegetables in their stores. And they have fast food restaurants that are literally killing them. So it's a much longer story. And we just stopped thinking about this for a long, long time. So the main obstacles, here it's not the suburbs as it is in schools. Well, I didn't say about schools, sorry, let me go back just quickly. Suburban schools, suburban public schools are actually private schools. Well, how can public schools be private schools? Well, you can't send your kids to them unless you've paid the enrollment fee for the club, which is your down payment and your mortgage payments, or conceivably your monthly rental payments. Otherwise, your kids can't go to their school. And there are examples abound of, for example, people who do have enough money, who really want to live in the city, and they live in their city until their kids reach either school age or maybe middle school age, and they can't any longer go to the little cute school down the block. They're going to be mixed up in this big city school district, and they move to the suburbs like that. I mean, there's just tons of evidence about this. So this is Gerald Frug's idea, the Harvard law professor who writes a lot about cities. Wonderful stuff, F-R-U-G. And he points this out a long time ago. So in effect, public schools, which are now by the right wing called, are you ready for this? Government schools. Okay, as opposed to those good private charter schools. They are, in effect, private schools. So back to food. The main obstacles are giant food company lobbying and big bias in research universities and massive advertising, especially to children. They want to addict us mentally and taste-wise, and they've done very well. So, is there a chance for structural change? Given this bleak outlook, can we do something about it? Does it make any sense for us to do something about it? Yeah, it does. And there's tons of evidence from the grassroots that this stuff is moving along. Oh, heck, I don't know where the quote is, but the city of Cleveland decided to I think 2011, to ban trans fats from its restaurants. And so they passed a law banning trans fats from its restaurant. The state government, the state legislature, then passed a law that amended the state constitution that said cities can no longer regulate what restaurants sell. But the lefty freaks in the city government got a hold of an email from the lobbyist for the Restaurant Association of Ohio. And the email said to somebody in the Department of Agriculture, we've got to have a law that gets rid of these rules, and this is what it should say. And that email became public. That's a little embarrassing, so a state court reversed this change in the Constitution. Cleveland got to do these laws. But this is just standard practice throughout the country, that cities are restrained from doing this kind of stuff on their own behalf by heavy, heavy, heavy influence over state governments. We'll talk about where this comes from in a little while. Well, there have also been big changes in USDA rules, from the food pyramid to the food plate. And here, nutritionists and activists have won a little bit, not a lot. Huge pitched battles, takes years to change these rules in the USDA, and they've been pushing very, very hard. There are food policy councils in cities all over the country. The city of Baltimore provides food packages for poor people in Baltimore at public libraries. So people who go to pick up their books can also get a package of food and take it home, of good, fresh food. I mean, there are lots and lots. Philadelphia provides, in effect, big supplements to food stamps at their farmers markets all over the Philadelphia, not just Philadelphia, but the whole region. There are huge innovations all over the country, that is, large numbers of innovations all over the country in school food programs, which have been horrifically damaged. They say to hire, the test for being a cafeteria worker in the United States, being a cook, is that you breathe, okay? I mean, they take it out of the freezer and they put it in the microwave and they put it out and poison the kids with it. But all the experiments in school districts all over the country, rich districts, poor districts, with farm to market, with kids growing their own food, with kids preparing their lunches, with fresh fruit and vegetables, is that the kids love it. One of the changes they made, this was in a Berkeley school. You know, Berkeley's, of course, always ahead of the curve. A school where my son had gone to school earlier. The teachers resisted these changes. You got Alice Waters there pushing them, and but the kids resisted. So, but they finally won the teachers over to allow them to change the schedule so that recess came before lunch. This had two effects. One, the kids were wiped out and really hungry after recess because they ran around for 45 minutes like crazy. And second, the period after lunch wasn't recess, so they didn't gobble their food and run out to recess. Instead, they ate very slowly. We didn't want to go to math or English or history, okay? So, and the nutritional results were phenomenal. The kids ate much more of the good food, and so this has been repeated. So I think there's some hope here. Lots of people have been thinking about this. The third one, drugs, prisons, and neighborhoods. Well, here, I got to be quick about this. There's 2 long chapters in the book, and I've written about it and published it elsewhere, so you can find it easily, but it's not quite parallel. Again, the problem with drugs is the drug war. It's not the drugs. Now, some of you are going to disagree with me. You're wrong. Okay. The drug war is a key element of urban policy. And unless we stop it, we got to forget the rest. 2.2 million people are in prison. 7.7 million are either in prison or somehow other connected to the justice system, on parole, that kind of thing. 3 or 4 times that you got to multiply that to get the number of people who are really involved. So 3 or 4 times we're talking about 25, 30 million people who are really involved with the drug war and the prison system that exploded in large part as a consequence of the drug war that really began again with Richard Nixon, who was really afraid of hippies and weirdos, but the guns were all trained on the black ghetto and the Latino barrio. Why have a drug war? Well, in theory, to reduce drug use, but it doesn't, it hasn't, it won't. Ample evidence that I'm not going to bother. Then why have the drug war? Well, first of all, it falls on neighborhoods where the drug warriors, where the politicians who push it, where the bankers who make money from it, don't live. So they don't even know what's happening and they don't care what's happening. And then there are all kinds of direct interests who make money from the drug war. Not just the private prison builders and private prison operators, but the food suppliers, the people who manufacture all the cop equipment, the new big vehicles they get that can attack you and wipe out a whole protesting mob and so forth. The list of beneficiaries is really very long. The consequences are terrible, though. There's violence, there's family separation, there's civil death, as we know from the new Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander's book. There's profound racial and class bias in the drug war and in the entire prison system. Again, just a little piece of theory. The place to look to really explain this, I think, is Loic Wacquant's work. He's a sociologist at Berkeley, trained with William Julius Wilson in Chicago, a French-American, a little tiny guy who, to do his studies in Chicago, decided he had to learn how to box. So he went to boxing clubs all over Chicago. Really did wonderful studies. And he says there are 4 phases of the peculiar institution. There's chattel slavery, there's Jim Crow, there's the northern ghetto that resulted from the massive migrations to work in the factories before World War I and before and during World War II. And then there is the one we have now, which is the intensified ghetto prison complex. How do we create this? Well, with biased arrest, biased convictions, biased sentences, and biased terms served. So let me repeat, why do we have this? Well, because there are all these institutional interests that, again, they don't conspire for this always, they sometimes do, but they really push. Just one little example. Where are the prisons? Typically, they're in small towns in rural areas that have voted reliably Republican, even in the state of California, for decades, because their livelihood depends on their jobs in and around this prison. It's an austerity exception. I'll get to austerity last in just a minute. This is where the feds are willing to spend money. Okay. The states are worrying about it now. They're closing down prisons here and there, but they're basically pushing the prisoners from state prisons into city jails. It's not really working. Well, I'll stop on that. We can talk about that if you want. Now I'll finish with comments on my 4th thing. So we have schools, we have food, we have the drug war, and then the first one in the book, but the last one right now, is austerity. Why do neoliberals target cities? Why have they targeted cities? Well, there are 2 reasons. One is the Willie Sutton reason. Now, most of you don't know who Willie Sutton was. He was a bank robber in the 20th century, a very famous American bank robber. And he kept getting caught, put in jail. And so they'd say, Willie, why do you rob banks? It's where the money is. Okay, so when the Congress wanted to cut the budget, starting in the 1970s, after the municipal transfers from the federal government had risen to a level where they ought to be. A lot of money came, mostly from the Johnson expansion. But this is Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and even on to Nixon. Okay, this went on for a very, very long time, this transfer program of funds. It actually stopped cold with Jimmy Carter, but that's too detailed. They thought, oh, we can't cut the defense budget. Give me a break. We can't cut the huge subsidies to big agriculture. You know, one of the early primary elections is in Iowa. You've heard of corn, you know. And there was a guy from Texas who was pushed out of the race because of his comments about not giving these subsidies. So the first reason is and they tried to cut, I'm glad they weren't able to do this one, they tried to cut Social Security benefits, and the Gray Panthers attacked that icon of probity, Ronald Reagan, and said, you can't take our money away. And Reagan thought, oh, I'm old too, I get it. And so they didn't. Okay, they beat him. They beat back to 3 places where they really could cut. What's the fourth? City expenditures. It was a ton of money, and they cut it. So one is Willie Sutton. That's where the money was. The Congress could cut it. In service to large corporations and wealthy individuals who didn't want to pay more taxes. Okay? Or didn't want to pay the taxes they were already paying. The second reason is sort of interesting. Every time they cut budgets, transfers to cities, things got worse in the cities. Oh, this can be very useful politically. Why should we spend money on this dump that's doing so badly? Well, that's what's called a positive feedback cycle, but in a negative direction. Okay? So it just drove things down and down and down. I could talk about a lot of things here. I'll just conclude very quickly. Paul Krugman says austerity is about using deficit panic to dismantle social programs. Peter Marcuse and Jamie Peck say austerity is something that the feds do to the states do to the cities, and the cities do to their poorest neighborhoods. These aren't accidents. These actually happen. So there's been this enormous withdrawal. William Simon was Secretary of the Treasury for Nixon and Ford, 1974. Headline New York Daily News. Ford to city, drop dead. Now, you know, if we take the sort of accumulation of metropolitan areas in the United States, over 200,000 population, it's 80% of the U.S. population lives in these relatively large urban areas. 200,000 isn't very much, I know, but it's big enough. This discussion in the election about the rural population, I don't quite get. I need to figure out more about this. But we're essentially a metropolitanized country, an urbanized country. So Ford wasn't saying all you got to drop dead. Ford was saying central cities drop dead. The Nixon-Ford Secretary of the Treasury, a guy named William Simon, laid it on the line when New York was about to go into deficit under Abe Beame, before the governor of New York State appointed the Big Mac, the Municipal Assistance Corporation, which became the model for the IMF and the World Bank to beat up on countries all around the world with austerity planning. You know, we all know this now because we all talk about the 1% and the 99%. But before Occupy Wall Street, that was taboo. That was just never discussed. So inequality is sort of on the radar. Once again, I'm arguing this is still alive. Simon said that New York City should entertain politically suicidal demands. He wanted them to raise transit fares, abolish rent control, and scrap free tuition at the senior university. So he really pushed hard. Victor Gottbaum, a big labor leader in New York, said Simon barely believed in government except for police and fire, and he's not sure about fire. Okay, so So this is what going. One final example, and I'll stop. There's a little city in Rhode Island called Woonsocket, 40,000 population, mostly French Canadians who moved a little bit south. That in 2012 had virtually collapsed. This little city of 40,000 people had a $10 million deficit. The school administration had laid off 20 teachers and other employees. The superintendent called it like an accident patient in an emergency room. Woonsocket citizens voted themselves a 13.8% property tax increase. When's the last time you heard something like that? They said, hey, we want to have schools that function. We need a police department. We need signal lights that actually turn on. We need a water system. Hello, Detroit. You know, we need things that actually function. So we're willing to pay more taxes for this. The state senate said, cool, do it. Once again, this had to be authorized by the state. The cities really can't do squat without some kind of authorization from the state. This is one that had to actually go to the legislature. The state senate said, cool. The state assembly voted it down. 54 to 55. So there's a bunch of cities, including the capital of Providence of Rhode Island, that had been virtually destroyed by state budget cuts by a previous right-wing governor. I could describe those. So one of the two conservative members who killed the relief bill for Woonsocket was himself a member of Alecs' national board. He likes these austerity moves. He says, you know, you never move faster than when you have a piano hanging over your head. He said, the receiver appointed by the state to run things as in Detroit as in Flint is that piano. So these guys were representatives of something called the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, funded by large corporations, of which a few skedaddled out of the way because of bad publicity after the Trayvon Martin Stand Your Ground law, which was also developed by ALEC. They write model state legislation, and they have virtually purchased conservative state legislatures from all over the country. They go to a big soiree once a year, and they're entertained. The corporations pay $25,000, $50,000 to belong. The legislators pay virtually nothing to go. Who knows what they do while they're there. But and they do this model legislation. In this case, the residents of the city say, hey, we're going to tax ourselves so we can survive and improve things in the city. The state legislature says, no, you won't. We're not going to let you do this. Just like the state of Ohio telling Cleveland they can't get trans fats out of their fast food restaurants. So there's ways to fight back, but we have to recognize what the problems are. I've taken up plenty of your time. Thank you.
Some questions? Yeah.
So how do we fight back in the austerity? I'll give you the easy question.
Yeah.
Sorry, but I mean, it seems like you've given us some examples on some of the other things, or you can think of examples. That one is the hard.
Well, my answer on how do we fight back on austerity, I guess, is that we have been shocked by the last 6 months of electoral news, advertising, hype, whatever we want to call it, for the first time in the history of presidential elections, certainly not in 2012, certainly not in 2008, these things were simply, you never heard about inequality. And now it's there all the time. Trump is going to have to constantly respond to questions about inequality. So what I guess I'm going to say is, and this is clearly more diffuse than the others. I mean, schools, cities are supposedly running. Food, you just can't miss because you got these extensive food deserts. Access is difficult, and you have grocery store rules. The drug war is just such an obvious catastrophe that everybody's talking about it. Austerity. I guess my answer would be that it is on the agenda, it's in the headlines, the way it hasn't been for many, many, many decades. And I think it's going to be very difficult for anybody to take it off. I think the Trump election is actually a very confusing result. And I know Hillary got lots more votes than he got, but you know, it's been, everybody says it's 50-50. It's not 50-50, by the way, it's 25-25. Half of the age-eligible citizens of the United States do not vote in a presidential election. Good grief. In local elections in a non-presidential year, the numbers are much worse. So the winner gets 25-26% of the vote. The loser gets 23-24% of the vote. So basically, it's been an even divide between Democrats and Republicans. But for the very first time, this election was clearly, at least in part, a lot of people anguished for whatever reasons some of us might adduce at the incredible inequality between those of us who are in the establishment, includes you and me. I know that, even though we're only hanging at the edge of it and we're being bought up to keep people out of the action, but leave that aside. I think it's going to be very difficult to remove that from the political equation. I think people active in policy are going to have to at least genuflect, at least fake their attention, if not actually pay attention to distributional issues. Now, that's a long ways from saying we're going to elect next Franklin Roosevelt and we're going to have a real another New Deal. I just don't know. I mean, international affairs playing into this in such a massive way, nobody's figured out it. I've spent a lot of my career doing international work on underdevelopment. You know, the rich world managed to underdevelop the poor world very effectively for several centuries. We've talked about this for decades. Now that world is grabbing some of it back. There's just no question about that. How the United States and Western Europe are going to respond to their former clients not putting up with quite the amount of crap they've always had to put up with is something that no American political party is ready for. And apparently no British political party, I'm not sure any French. So my only answer is that inequality is on the agenda. Occupy Wall Street, put new vocabulary into the minds of newspaper editors and writers. It's there, and I think my guess is it helps even in your neighborhood work, that people can think about this. Maybe I'm wrong. Tricia?
Yeah, so to bring this down to like a personal story, and I know you're very familiar, intimate with the prison drug complex, you know, and you were beginning to tell me the story of how incarceration would help this young woman, you know, get over her addiction, but then once out, she would kind of get into it again and then get back in. How is that system, what is happening to putting her back in jail, and where are the leverage points for getting out?
Well, let me switch the discussion from the conceivable restorative value of what are called correctional institutions, which are not, they're punishment institutions across the country, to a little bit of comparison. The United States outweighs virtually every other country on earth on this. And if we look at modern industrial democracies, we're talking about incarceration rates in the United States that are not twice, but 4 or 5, even 10 times the rate in other countries. I highly recommend Michael Moore's very funny movie, Who Shall We Invade Next? For a look at prisons. I mean, for me, that's enough. But if you compare European incarceration rates with American incarceration rates. It's simply insanity. And if you compare typical European treatment of drugs with treatment in the United States, we look insane again. Typically, and Portugal is maybe the best example, but the Netherlands is others, they've been extraordinarily tolerant about the consumption of what we call recreational drugs. They don't put people in jail for it, period. They may once in a while put somebody in jail who's selling tons of the stuff and they can catch, but even that they tend not to do. Instead, people who are having problems with drug addiction, or as we do with alcohol addiction, they have all kinds of programs for treatment, for counseling, for warning. In Portugal, you got to meet with a committee of, I think, 3 or 4 people, sort of a justice official, somebody from the cops or the prosecutor's office, with a social worker, and with some other kind of person. And they just talk to you about what you're supposed to do. They haven't had huge spikes in drug consumption, some in some cities in the Netherlands, but not very much. So all these warnings just were present. The tremendous UN study that Fernando Henrique Cardoso was on, and the president of, I guess, Finland was on, a woman chaired, and said, this is nonsense. There's no drug problem. There's a drug war problem. How can we treat people who actually have drug problems better? Well, first of all, we can stop having a war that adds to the drug problems with family dissolution, with isolation, with putting them into criminal training camps, which is what the prisons also are. I mean, you get in prison, that's where you learn how to really commit crimes. So you go in, you get caught for being a scout or actually selling some pot on the street or worse drugs, and then you get put in jail for 2 years or 5 years or even 10 years. By the time you're done, you're really ready for some heavy-duty crime, because there's no way to be reinserted into society without committing a crime, unless you're particularly lucky and you have relatives who can sustain you. So, and states now find the expense for this criminal justice system, the jails, just unsustainable. So I think the pressures on it are coming from all around. What's going to happen with it as a result of this election? I mean, you can't be sanguine about that. I don't know. I mean, clearly we've elected a president who would like to put him in, lock him up and throw away the key. So I don't, but again, it's on the radar, it's there. And what I'm arguing is that if we reconceive urban policy as not being the stuff we normally do, housing, transportation, land use, public facilities, recreation, social services, all extraordinarily important. But reconceive at least part of our attention on these damages done to cities from the outside. We'll see these four. I mean, there are 3 more big damages. Healthcare, which we had sort of taken care of, but we'll see what happens. I mean, single payer will work if we ever get it. Works everywhere else in the rich world, but who knows if we'll get there. The environment, we have a conference going on as we're talking right here, right now, on the urban environment. So I haven't dealt with either of those. There's a third I forget. But I'm saying if we pull together, if city authorities, mayors, these Democrats who run cities, pull together, they're concerned citizens about schools, food, the drug war, and the 1%, and build new political coalitions, we might be able to turn the corner. Yes, sir.
Let's get the last one. Thanks for your talk, Dr. Goldsmith. I was really curious about food, and I was wondering if in your research you found any kind of policies or anything cities are doing where, one thing you identified is we live in a place with very bad access to healthy food. For many parts of cities, you have kids who wake up and the closest food between them and school is a bag of chips from the corner store. And I was wondering if there's any progressive policies or anything that planners are doing that kind of addresses this.
Yeah, there is. I have actually a long passage of the book about the fact that, I think it was 1984, Anne Spearn published a wonderful book called The Granite City. I think it's called that, something like that.
Yeah, just Granite Garden.
The Granite Garden, thank you, yeah. And I used to teach in it, and so I went back and I looked, and it's an absolutely marvelous book in the natural environment of the city. There's virtually no mention of, I mean, I used to discuss this in my class, it never came up, we didn't talk about food. So from about 1910 or 1920, when there was still a lot of activity by city planners and city engineers, civil engineers, improving water systems and sewage systems and creating food halls to focus transportation and clean up the rats and provide more food for cities. There's a tremendous amount of work that intertwine nutrition, city planning, and public health. For 100 years we stopped. And then about 15 years ago, wow, it's just been a juggernaut. There are new journals, there are articles in every journal of record of city planning and public health that have public health people are worried about city things and the city people are worried about health and food things. So suddenly it's come together. So there's a whole lot. But on specific answer to your question, so out of this are coming lots of ideas. There are cities and states that pass regulations that say you have to have so many feet or such a proportion of your shelf space for fresh fruits and vegetables in order to get a permit to operate a store. It's remarkable. There are cities that are passing legislation. Well, Bloomberg failed in New York for the super size me stuff, but Berkeley did pass, it's Berkeley, I know, but they did pass a law taxing sugar in drinks. San Francisco actually passed, but they needed a supermajority because of the stupid way they wrote the law to get. So they didn't get 2/3; they only got 55%, something like that. Passed an even tougher tax on food, drinks, and other cities are doing this. Chicago banned foie gras. I mean, there's all kinds of funny things you can do. But there's a lot of action on this, and there's tremendous innovation, sometimes involving city governments in these food councils, but with school foods. For example, excluding vending machines from schools, which of course give a part of their profits to the school districts. So the school districts say, sure, we'll poison the kids, because otherwise we can't pay the teachers. It's a dilemma, just like prisons say, oh yeah, you can make phone calls because we get 3/4 of the money back. So there have been movements against or in favor of all these things, and they've been actually moving on. There's a wonderful directory of local action put out by the Harvard Law School. I can the titles in the book, so you can go buy the book and find it. So yeah, I'm actually quite optimistic on food. I think we may have less resistance and more action at the sort of superficial public political level. Tremendous resistance, sort of, do I dare call it organic resistance? I mean, it's in the structure of the society from corporations that make money from selling us more food, and we buy more food if they stick in a lot of sugar, fat, and salt. And I have a list on one page of the number of books and movies that have come out between, 2009 and 2013, I think I had, and I missed a couple that I didn't even know about. It's like there's like a dozen each of books about how we're poisoning ourselves and with our food, and it's the fast food nation and supersize me. I mean, it's just endless sort of barrage of stuff. So a lot of people must be watching it. No, it's not in the big multiplexes. It's only in the art theaters that weirdos like us really want to know that. But somebody's got to get the message and then begin to spread it. So I think, I stayed in the city planning profession all these years, despite titling my courses Why Planning Fails. I mean, the faculty used to say to him, Goldsmith, you can't do that. They just paid a huge tuition to come to graduate school for 2 years, and you're telling them in the first introductory course. Well, but I kept at it because I think these are the reasons we do fail, but I think there's promise that if we can't do it, who can? So, yeah, it's a miserable world out there, but it already was miserable, so let's see what we can do at the time. Thanks for the question. Thank you.
And that's a nice segue, so at 7 o'clock tonight at, what is it,
Resistencia.
Resistencia bookstore. At 7 o'clock, there's a book signing, so if you wanna, join them there and talk more about it, we'll be in.
Yeah, so if some of you were there, I'll be very careful not to simply repeat this. I have another sort of way to approach this with a set of questions that I ask myself and then answer them, so. Anyway, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.